Welcome to Arthurian April! Why Arthurian April? Well, I love the alliteration, and there's something fitting about exploring the Arthurian mythos as we have fully transitioned from winter into spring. The Arthurian mythos, with its themes of rebirth and redemption, parallels the Easter season, featuring Christian influences like the Holy Grail and the promise that the once and future king will return. My journey into Arthurian literature began unexpectedly when I happened to view for the very first time John Borman's 1980s film Excalibur. The film, to say the least, captivated me completely with its compressed version of the Arthurian mythos, kind of a warts and all effect that made me hunger for more. And that's why I started to dive in deep. While there are countless Arthurian works, T.H. White's The Once and Future King is unquestionably the alpha of modern Arthurian storytelling. White transformed Sir Thomas Malory's 15th century La Morte d'Arthur into an accessible, novelized form for 20th century readers. This 600-page epic, which I finished last night, I read all of it, all of it. It consists of 4 distinct parts. Let's break them all down one by one. First up, The Sword and the Stone. Most famous for the Disney adaptation, which I'm pretty certain I saw once when I was a kid. Maybe on the Disney Channel, maybe on VHS. What works the best, you have things like Merlin's character as like a time-traveling wizard who ages backwards. It's kind of hard to understand at first because he's physically aging like Benjamin Button, but his actual awareness is more similar to like River Song from Doctor Who. And so really like people are aging this way and he's aging this way and he's aware of like all these future events, even up to what was then the modern day. It's pretty neat. It's a neat concept. It's hard to understand because it's not meant to be understood, but it's the thing about the early going throughout the Once and Future King that I found the most compelling and fascinating. There are also a number of animal transformation sequences, which are kind of like the hallmark of the movie too. But this is how Merlin imparts a ton of lessons on the young wart. Like, for example, he will turn him into a fish and he learns about some of the dangers of the animal kingdom. He then gets turned into like a goose and he learns about the temporal nature of territories and how fleeting they are. And he gets turned into a hawk and he learns about militaristic actions and activities. It's a pretty neat and effective formula for setting up the kind of leader Arthur will become in future books. And then there's the whimsical tone that really balances humor with kind of, I guess, deeper philosophical themes. One of the things that I immediately compared it to was like Terry Pratchett in how it has like sort of a knowing tone. And this is, of course, pre-Terry Pratchett, so it's probably like an influence of his or was an influence of his. But that's something that I think really kind of sets it apart from other retellings of historical fiction. It uses Arthur to make a point about war and humanity and the current issues of the day. On the other hand, what doesn't work, well, the structure gets pretty repetitive. I think that while the animal lessons are pretty interesting for a while, they do start to beat down on you. I get it. I get it. Yes, badgers like humans. Yes. Okay, snakes. They want to understand their past too, just like humans and the origin of their species. Yes, I get it. And occasionally the episodic nature of the work feels a little disconnected. There is an entire stretch where Arthur and his adopted brother Kay, they go out into the woods, then they meet Robin Hood, basically. Well, it's called Robin Wood, but again, bad T.H. White jokes. But then they go and face Morgan Le Fay, who is Arthur's sort of eternal enemy for the most part in the mythos and other places. And it kind of doesn't really amount to much. I mean, it's an early example of Arthur and his leadership abilities and like him putting him in a sense of danger and stuff. But it never comes up again. And there's a lot of things that happen in The Sword and the Stone that don't come up again until later on in the work when Arthur has like later epiphanies. But some of that is of interest, like this idea that like as kids, we remember things and things happen and they're so major to us, but by the time we're adults, we've forgotten so much of it, or it wasn't really that big a deal at all. And I kind of feel like this is sort of White's version of that, but at the same time, you're spending a lot of time reading this stuff, and a little bit goes a long way. I still enjoyed it. I still think it has a lot of great strengths. And overall, I think it is a pretty fun introduction to the Once and Future King. So I give it 3.5 stars. And then we have The Queen of Air and Darkness, probably the weakest work overall of the four. And I think that's like not a surprise for me to say, or an unpopular opinion. That tends to be the consensus, I think. But it's a darker section, and it focuses on the Orkney clan from, I guess, the Orkney Islands, which is like way up there in Scotland. And it introduces us to Morgause, who is Morgan Le Fay's sister, as well as Arthur's half-sister, which we learn through the course of the narrative, and her children, which include Gawain, or Garwin, or Gawain, whichever. I think we'll say Gawain for now. Yeah, it introduces and expands the cast a bit. I think what works the best about The Queen of Air and Darkness is the introduction of these crucial characters. I mean, it's an establishing chapter. It is sort of a tertiary piece that is this between bridging point between Arthur's childhood, his crowning to become king, and then what happens when he begins to expand his kingdom throughout England. And we get a chance to learn a little more about other characters that had popped up in The Sword and the Stone. But specifically, this is the Orkney clan's tale and how it counterbalances that of Arthur. And I think Arthur's development of the might for right philosophy is pretty interesting. This idea that might is not the correct way to establish dominance over other people. Instead, it's influencing people to do the right thing. And he uses his army and his weaponries to do that, which is kind of, I mean, it's still might, really, but it's might for the right reasons. It's like, as far as what doesn't work on this one, I mean, it's quite a bit, but I mean, it's really paced pretty poorly. It's the only book where I was starting to wonder if like I wasn't going to make it to the end. There's this whole stretches that deal with characters that are kind of tertiary that, you know, they're okay to spend some time with, but like I don't need multiple chapters about the questing beast and King Pellinore and and the characters that kind of surround him and Grumore and all these guys. It's too much. It's also just less compelling than what bookends it. I mean, Sword and Stone's a lot of fun, and then what comes is even better, and it just kind of feels like this weak middle chapter. This is for sure the weakest part of the collection, but it also establishes essential elements for the coming tragedy. So I am going to give The Queen of Air and Darkness 2.5 stars. Here is where the Once and Future King really finds its voice. The Ill-Made Knight focuses on Sir Lancelot, his complex character, and the love triangle between Arthur and Guinevere. It's so readable and so involving and engaging. It's excellent. If there's one piece of the Once and Future King I could recommend anyone to read, they should read The Ill-Made Knight. Let's talk about like some of its stronger points. I think White's reinvention of Lancelot's pretty fascinating. Normally he's this dashing, handsome figure and usually sort of like the epitome of what a round table chivalric knight should be. But instead, White turns him into kind of like an ugly, unattractive figure. He describes him a few different ways, looking like Quasimodo in the face, just in the face, not the body. Generally, he also has described him as looking like an ape, which made me think maybe he looked like one of those realistic pictures of Homer Simpson, but with hair. Or he also has described him as the ugliest man that a certain character has ever seen. And that is all sort of counterbalanced by his general spiritual beauty, which is wrapped up both in his own self-honor as well as a devout belief in God. And then there's this very nuanced portrayal of the love triangle between Lancelot, Guinevere, and Arthur that I think is the most compelling thread of the entire book. Not only because one could really study why Guinevere is so attractive to someone so physically unattractive as Lancelot, which I think is, worthy of its own deeper discussion. But the idea that Arthur could be very aware of this, all happening under his nose, and choosing to just look away. Also, because Arthur and Lancelot are very close friends, so close that they spend all this time together, and they're very jovial, and they trust one another and love one another in a very platonic way. Maybe that's another thing that I think, I could see the queer reading between Lancelot and Arthur as I was reading the book. But on the other hand, I can also see it as something that's completely platonic, and it's more of a sort of spiritual love between two people that feel like they could have been brothers. And Lancelot struggles with this idea of his own adultery and physical needs, and the idea that he is a soldier of God and wants to perform miracles in his name and become the greatest knight in the world in his name and utilize his physical strength for God's own ends and purposes. This idea, this tug of war spiritually that he finds himself in, does drive him to the brink of madness at times. And I think that is utterly compelling to read. Sorry, Lancelot. With Lancelot being introduced, the other thing that I think is worthy of note is how it introduces French chivalry into this Britain Anglo-Saxon set. Lancelot historically didn't come into the Arthurian mythos until the Norman conquest and William the Conqueror, and French culture began to sort of overwhelm the British Isles. And White does something pretty cool here throughout the book, really, but it's in this section where it becomes the most pronounced that he kind of hyper times his way through Arthurian history. And so, like, the first couple of books are really more set around the time of post-Roman Britain. And then the second book is dealing with those post-Roman Britons dealing with the invading tribes of the Angles and the Saxons, and as well as the Gaels in northern England and Scotland. And then finally, with Lancelot du Lac coming, it's the arrival of Normans and the French and the like. And that adds like a cool historical wrinkle that allows this to feel like it's unmoored in time in a way that really adds to the overall timelessness of the book. No flaws, baby. Masterpiece. 5 stars. And then last up, we have The Candle in the Wind, which brings all the threads together as Mordred plots against Arthur and the Round Table, and his final plan kind of comes into place. It's here that we see the tragic acceleration of Arthur's downfall. Everything that has led up to this moment kind of comes into the fore and wraps itself together in one big quilt. You have the affair between Lancelot and Guinevere. You have all the moments within the Orkney clan that led to Mordred and his conception and his need for revenge because of actions Arthur took in his younger days. And then, of course, like Arthur's own philosophical flaws in his plans and the mistakes he made as he became a king and began to conquer all of the lands that surrounded him. This all comes together and leads to one final battle. Also, the section that has White's portrayal of the Holy Grail quest, which he largely skips. To it, I had wondered how White might loop in the Grail quest, which feels like such an aside from everything else. But I think the way it's handled is quite brilliant in that he's trying to find spiritual meaning for the Round Table, particularly as so much of that power and might that he's trying to utilize for good is becoming more and more untethered, and it really feels like it exists to serve only itself. And this is why he and Lancelot with his very pious attitude towards religion and Christian faith, this sort of leads itself to like a very natural conclusion that yes, we will use our collective might to find sacred relics, including the most sacred relic of all. So really enjoy how White creates a parallel between Mordred and 20th century fascism, 21st century fascism now, I guess. Mordred in his rise to power, ends up creating a political movement that is pretty synonymous with the rise of fascism in Nazi Germany, which this was written around the same time that Hitler had come into power and the Axis powers began to expand throughout Europe. He creates very similar imagery with Mordred and the sort of like broader populist movement that has like expanded beyond him in conflict with Arthur and his armies. And you have the poignant portrayal of Arthur in his final battle, which is a very frail, sickly king, not unlike what he appeared like in the Green Knight film. Very just, it's like he could barely get out of bed. And here he is in a tent getting ready to battle Mordred and picking up his sword for one last time. We hadn't seen him battle anyone for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages. And now, in the very last moments of his life, he's going to go and face Mordred face to face. It's so beautifully written, and it's a reflection of like everything that led up to it, and really summarizes and acts as a summation of all of White's beliefs of like Arthur and the Round Table as a functionary for anti-war sentiment. And I think it was so good, and I just absolutely loved the last chapter. I would give The Candle in the Wind 4.5 stars. What does that average out to? I guess overall, The Once and Future King gets a 4-star rating. 4-star rating. While the first half, I think, has its issues, particularly in terms of pacing, it's the back half where I think the greater profundity lies, and it kind of pulls everything together in this beautiful tapestry that makes it really a must read, especially for someone who wants to kind of take their first step towards Arthurian literature and understanding its place in British history. And the question becomes, what's next? Once you've read that, there's so many other Arthurian books. There's a lot of options, so let's just roll through them really fast. I mean, the first thing you could do after you read The Once and Future King is that you could read the unpublished conclusion, The Book of Merlin, which some people don't really like, but Sword at Sunset by Rosemary Sutcliffe, which is a historically plausible Arthur, which is kind of a counterpoint to the more mythic presentation of The Once and Future King. There is a trilogy of books by Mary Stuart called the Arthurian Saga that are all from Merlin's POV of the Crystal Cave, the Hollow Hills, and the Last Enchantment. Or maybe you want to expand the scope even further, and that's when you have Park Godwin's Arthurian trilogy, which includes Fire Lord, Beloved Exile, and The Last Rainbow. It's kind of historical fantasy, right? With very limited magical elements, I understand. But Beloved Exile is the first of these books that really focuses on Guinevere, which I think is a weakness in White's portrayal overall. I think if there's one major flaw, it's that Guinevere doesn't get a bit of well-rounded characterization. You can tell he kind of struggled with her. But Godwin, he writes an entire book about her after Arthur's death. The Last Rainbow is about St. Patrick. It's a prequel before even Fire Lord. And so I think I might know what I'm going to read next St. Patrick's Day of Arthurian legend from the perspective of women. You have the Mists of Avalon, which is completely from all of the women characters, Guinevere, Morgan Le Fay, Morgause, etc. It's a very well-regarded book, but I'm also well aware of the accusations against Marion Zimmer Bradley, and I have had a lot of pause about ever reading this. I got it for free, so no one made any money off me. And lastly, in my collection, you've got some other books like The Camelot Chronicles by Jack White, which is a prequel to the prequel, which really focuses in on the post-Roman Britons who initially come up with the idea of Camelot. It's kind of a Randian take on Arthurian myth. Lastly, you've got maybe many people's favorite historical version of King Arthur in Bernard Cornwell's The Winter King, which is really gritty. Gritty. Hey, what's your favorite Arthurian legend? Have you read The Once and Future King? Have you read any of these other books? I'd love to get your take on it. And please, as always, like, comment, subscribe. Keep on reading. We'll see you next week.